Hi, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really glad you could make it along. I've got a fabulous interview coming up for you this hour, and I know you're just going to love it. My guest has had such an incredible career that he really is a household name the world over. He's soft rock singer, songwriter, guitarist, pianist, and producer Kenny Loggins. He's had a consistent string of hits through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and he's recently released his autobiography. Kenny Loggins played in several bands in the late 60s, honing his songwriting chops as a staff writer at a music company. He rose to prominence as part of the duo Loggins Messina with fellow singer and songwriter Jim Messina. Kenny Loggins has had hit after hit after hit, both as a solo performer and writer, since his time with Jim Messina. His gift for crafting deeply emotional music is unparalleled, and it's been part of his life for as long as he can remember. In fact, if what I read is correct, he was no more than around 7 years old when he wrote his first song.
I don't know about that. That'll be the urban legend. That I was interested in rock and roll and songwriting early on was probably because of my two big brothers. I had watched them trying to write a song together and getting nowhere. And I remember thinking it can't be that difficult. And I really didn't start writing till I was probably a junior in high school. Then while I was taking guitar lessons, I just automatically started writing songs.
And was it as easy as you thought it was?
It kind of was, because I found that there was some part of me that wrote the song automatically. It was almost like, the same thing with poetry when I was in school, and they'd say, "Oh, we want you guys to take an hour and write a poem." This thing would just pour out. And I was thinking, I don't know where this is coming from, but it's kind of fun and easy. And so I pursued it. Partly, as they say, part of it is the inspiration, and part of it is, how do you craft a song? How do you craft a lyric? And that took time.
So where did you learn that from? Was that just being thrown in the deep end and working it out as you went?
I think so. Yeah, it was. I was a student of Lennon and McCartney, and of course Bob Dylan, and because I came through the folk era, but I also was a big fan of rock and roll and R&B because I had two big brothers. As you get into it and as you start to work at it, you see what's working and what isn't working, and you begin to get ideas about how to make what you're doing sound more like a real song.
Yeah. Well, you scored a job working for a music company as a staff writer there, which must have given you a great boost. But the first big break, as I understand it, came along when Nitty Gritty Dirt Band actually recorded some of your work.
That's right. Had a job as a songwriter, $65 a month for ABC Wingate. And for that, they got House of Pooh Corner and a few other standards and some early Loggins and Messina stuff. And the way I would get my songs heard was I would go to different parties around town. And this one particular party that I went to, there were a couple guys there from the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and we were all sort of sitting in a circle trading tunes. And one thing led to another, and I showed them House of Pooh Corner. I showed them half a dozen of my songs. They wanted to record House of Pooh Corner, and then they turned me on to their manager, John McEwen. And John really loved what I was doing. So they had about 4 or 5 of my songs on their Uncle Charlie album. And that was the beginning of getting my stuff heard.
Amazing. You must have thought you were eating a bit working for that $65 at the time, did you?
Yeah, well, I considered myself lucky because my rent was $65 a month. So I always say it wasn't 1909. It was just a shitty place to live, but it all worked out.
And Jim tells the story about the two of you meeting actually through one of your brothers. Is that right?
Right. My brother Dan became an A&R man for Columbia Records years later. And when he first was signed on by Clive Davis to go into training for A&R, he and his best friend, Don Ellis, who would become the president of RCA Records, they grew up together and they met Jimmy Messina. So they connected me and Jimmy together.
And you'd been a fan of Buffalo Springfield, hadn't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was one of my big influences was Stephen Stills and Buffalo Springfield. Yeah.
So you and Jim, when you got together, what was the magic between the two of you? Was it the way you harmonised, the way you wrote? Can you explain what it was that clicked?
Of course, that's an impossible question to answer because explaining the magic of a combination. But We definitely, I heard the Everly Brothers in our voices early on. There was an Everly's quality that we wanted to exploit, just as the Beatles did. The Beatles rarely gave the appropriate nod to the Everly Brothers, but you can hear it in their early work, especially. But there was that kind of Everly's blend in our voices that caught our attention right away. And we were both very nasal singers, so it all kind of blended together. And I think there was magic in that. And also, Jimmy had some great songs that he had not been allowed to sing in Poco. And when he showed them to me, the first one I did, we initially thought we were making a Kenny Loggins record produced by Jimmy Messina. I'm sure he told you. And so he gave me his song Peace of Mind to work up for the Kenny Loggins record. And that's the only song you'll ever hear, only Jimmy Messina song you will ever hear Kenny Loggins singing. And that's when we realized, oh, this is a duo. Even at that point, we hadn't really thought of ourselves as a duo band. We thought of ourselves as a one record duo. That's why he came up with the idea of calling it Sitting In.
So you didn't think that you'd have a future together?
We weren't thinking of it that way. We figured the first record would be Kenny Loggins with Jimmy Messina sitting in, like a jazz record thing. And then the next record would be Kenny Loggins produced by Jimmy Messina. But Clive did not like the idea of promoting a band that was going to break up. So he insisted that he would not release Sitting In unless we committed to a 6-year deal.
Were you reluctant to do that?
Well, it caught me by surprise, as you can imagine. But at the same time, I thought, yeah, there's definitely chemistry here. We're really clicking and we're having fun. So sure, yeah, pay me.
Big time.
You're right.
You were writing a whole lot of songs yourself at that time, and one of my favourites was Danny's song. That was a very personal song to you, wasn't it? Because it was about your brother having his first child.
Right, right. And a lot of it was taken from a letter that he wrote to me after Colin, his son, was born, and telling me that they were going to get married and move to Northern California. And so, he will be like she and me, as free as a dove, was sort of a paraphrase of one of the lines from the letter. Pisces Virgo rising is a very good sign. That was from the letter.
What got you right into children's songwriting?
I didn't perceive House of Pooh Corner as a children's song when I wrote it. It was a song of farewell to my childhood from the point of view of being a senior in high school, about to graduate, and some part of me knowing that my childhood was over. At least I thought it was. It comes back when you have kids of your own. But to me, that was just, I wrote myself into that story in that song. I didn't realize that I was, what, 16, 17? I didn't realize that I'd have to get permission from whoever owned Winnie the Pooh. And that would be the Disney Corporation, not long after that.
But you did manage to get that permission, obviously.
Well, I was dating the daughter of the CEO of the Disney Corporation.
That always helps.
Yeah, you got to go to the top, right? But I didn't really realize that until, I met her and we got into this. It wasn't really a relationship, very casual dating thing, but she introduced me to her father and I sang the song to her dad, and then he called the lawyers.
Better than calling the police.
Yeah, right. Could have gone that way, I suppose.
Were you a bit of a celebrity at school?
No, not really. No, I was very shy and, big ears, buck teeth for quite a while. And so the shyness and the music was my way of getting around that shy, introverted self. But that took time, it took a while to develop that part of myself.
So you were kind of that geeky boy in the corner writing songs and strumming a guitar.
Yeah, but for fortune, I would have been Elvis Costello. Just kind of sitting there with my glasses on.
House of Pooh Corner sold millions for Kenny Loggins, and unbeknown to him, he was just getting started. Don't you go anywhere, as this story continues in just a sec. Thanks so much for hanging in. I'm chatting with superstar Kenny Loggins, who's just admitted that he was a shy, geeky kid who discovered very early on that he had a natural gift for songwriting.
Being in the music business required me to get over being shy and put myself out there and just show up. And it's the showing up that changes you.
How was that for you? That must have been really difficult in the beginning.
Yeah, it was. It was. And I wasn't sure how to go about doing it. And that's why I think Jimmy was very much a mentor for me in that way. And sometimes there's good and bad with that mentorship. One is that Jimmy was a mentor and a teacher. At the same time, he was a quote partner, but we're both developing solo careers. So there's a conflict within that partnership of one-upsmanship, which I think exists in a lot of bands. I think that's why bands break up so soon, because they're trying to one up each other, and they're only 18, 19, 20 years old. So we barely knew who we were at all. And then all of a sudden we're enmeshed in this duo, and we're trying to find our individual personalities while presenting the idea of a solid duo to the world. There was a lot to learn about how to show up for not only hiring and firing a band, but hiring agents, hiring managers, but creating a tour, road managers, the whole infrastructure of putting a business together. And Jimmy had been experienced in that area, so I learned a lot from him on that. The positive was I learned a lot. The negative was I learned his way. And then I had to learn, there are other ways to do this.
And in pursuit of finding your way, was that what led to the breakup of the two of you in 1976?
Not really. I would say that what led to the breakup was the actual creation of the duo. We were really two solo artists who'd really just thought of ourselves as soloists who'd come together for one record. And then, okay, so we're thrown together for 6 records. Let's make the most of that. Let's, share our material as much as we can. But we were both really ready to break up right from the beginning. So when that 6-year time period came, I was like, thanks, see ya.
But you're still good friends today, aren't you?
Yeah, we're good. We get along well.
You went off then to find your solo career, and boy, did you find it in a very big way. The following year, in 77, you wrote that fabulous song for Barbra Streisand to sing in A Star Is Born. Were the hits just pouring out of you already then?
Looking back at it, you could think that I was definitely writing a lot. I was very excited about finally going solo. The metaphor is pulling the arrow back in the bow, right? It was back there for quite a while before we let it go. So I found that my writing in that last year of Loggins Messina evolved dramatically. I was finding new chords and new ways of putting them together. And I had melodic ideas that were just completely different from anything I'd done with Loggins Messina. I knew I was heading in a sort of an R&B direction. Years later, someone would dub it yacht rock. But it was really from Celebrate Me Home on that I started moving in a more R&B or R&B inflected approach to my music, using more R&B type chordal progressions, and really found myself drawn to that style of music that Stevie Wonder was sort of the spearhead of.
Was it taking up every waking moment?
No, I still had time to get married and things like that. So there's other waking moments to deal with, but I was very driven. No one had told me that you can't break out of a successful duo and become a successful solo. I didn't know what the odds were against me, so I kept doing it because I was naive enough to think, well, this is going to happen just like the first thing happened. Now this is going to happen. I'll just keep going. And really, the moment I think that made the biggest difference in my solo career was meeting Stevie Nicks when I opened for Fleetwood Mac during Rumors, and becoming a friend of Stevie's. We would hang out in clubs after the shows and stuff. And she had quite an entourage of people that would travel with her. So there was a lot of partying going on. And in the process, we became friends, as well as Mick. And then she said, well, if you ever need a singer, give me a call. So, of course, she was by that point the most popular female singer in the world. So, of course, I gave her a call. And that duet with Whenever I Call You Friend really broke my solo career.
So when your career had that huge boost with Whenever I Call You Friend, how did life change for you then?
Well, it changed primarily because I could suddenly play bigger venues.
Right.
And then that led to bigger audiences, which I could then continue to put in new material. And I just kept working it.
Did your head run away with you? Did you let all that fame and fortune get to you, or did you manage to stay grounded?
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
I'm talking to you.
Yeah, right. I know. I think I managed to stay grounded. But my kids tell me not so much. My oldest son says, Dad, you have no idea what real life is like. Because, remember, I was a so-called rock star from the time I was 21 on. So, I never even learned how to cook a burger for myself. It's like when you've got enough money to hire somebody to do that, you do it.
So you never had to put out the trash, you never had to walk the dog, all the kind of mundane things that we do.
Yeah, not entirely. My first wife, when I would get home from the road, Eva would say, "Well, you may be hot shit out here, but here you take out the garbage." It's like, oh, okay. We'll call that grounding.
Right. Good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm chatting with Kenny Loggins. The hits just kept on coming for you, Kenny, and there is a fabulous story about how you got together with Michael McDonald, of course, from the Doobie Brothers. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Of course. I heard "Living on a Fault Line," that Doobie Brothers album, when we were beginning Loggins Messina, and I thought, this guy is amazing. I've got to write with him. And so I put the word out through management, and I found out through the grapevine that he was looking for collaborators. So finally we connected. I got a writing date and headed over to his house. And as I was unpacking my guitar out of the trunk of my car, I could hear music coming from the front door of his home. His door was ajar, and I could hear piano things going on. And as I'm walking up to the front door, I hear dun dun da 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 da, and he's singing "Broad Shepherd running low," and I couldn't understand the words because he wasn't actually singing words. But at one point, he stops abruptly and says to his sister, "That's all I've got." And I knock on the door, and my imagination had kept going. And when he stopped playing, my imagination heard what would become the B section of that song. So I knock on the door and I say, "Hey, Mike," I said, "play that thing you were just playing, because I think I know how the next section goes." And so I like to say that we were writing together before we ever met.
And of course, that song won a Grammy for you both, didn't it?
Yep. Yep.
That was your first Grammy.
And then the next year, we wrote "This Is It," and that won a Grammy.
You were just on fire.
And
It still doesn't stop, because in the 80s, you ended up with a whole new career being called the king of the movie soundtrack.
yeah, go figure. What happened was disco. I just happened to get a phone call. You mentioned when I wrote for Barbara on "Star Is Born," "I Believe in Love." And in the process of doing that song, Barbara Streisand's boyfriend at the time was John Peters. And John and I became friends. And then he and Barbara split up, and he started his own production company. And their first project was Caddyshack. So when he was almost done with that movie, he called me and said, "Would you come check out my movie? I'd love for you to write something for it." So I stopped by his studio and I watched a rough cut of Caddyshack, and I loved it. Laughed all the way through it, and I said, "I want to write everything for it. What can I do?" So we have other writers, but I want you to write at least a couple of songs. So I think I have 4 songs in that movie soundtrack. That was the beginning of me writing for movies. And then my friend Dean Pitchford wrote a screenplay. So I read his screenplay. As a favor to Dean, he and I wrote the title song for his screenplay, which was called Footloose. And the next thing you know, he's got the biggest movie of the summer. It's the right place at the right time. So much luck comes into this business.
It's also about who you know and how talented you are, isn't it?
I think, yeah, well, it's all of the above, right? They say to be ready for the opportunities when they arise is the trick. So it's just, it's one thing to have that door open, but it's another thing to have your chops together where you can write a Footloose. And Danger Zone, very similar situation. I was in the studio. I had chosen to write for the volleyball scene of Top Gun because I knew no one else would. So I wrote Playing with the Boys. And while I was in the studio working on that, I got a call from Giorgio Moroder's office saying, "Giorgio needs you to sing this song that he's got at the top of the movie because the act we had has fallen out thanks to the lawyers." So I was down the street. So I said, "Okay, I'll be right there." Next day, we're in the studio and I sing the vocal.
Toto was the band that was supposed to record Danger Zone. REO Speedwagon were approached too, and Bryan Adams also declined because he thought the movie was a glorification of war. Stay tuned for more from lucky Kenny Loggins. Welcome back. I'm really chuffed to be chatting with one of the most popular soft rock singers of the 70s, 80s and 90s. Kenny Loggins has enjoyed an amazing career, having sold more than 25 million records Kenny, your friendship with the late Michael Jackson also proved to be really fruitful because he was the one who pulled you into We Are the World.
Right, right. I met him when he was showcasing Off the Wall, and we became instant friends. And he called me when the Jacksons were doing their reunion tour. And so when We Are the World came around, he called me literally and said, you know, I've got a project that I'd like you to be in on. You want to do it? Of course, it was like Michael Jackson, duh. So so I show up, and it's We Are the World. And then he really gifted me by putting me on that front line with the other lead singers.
What was it like doing that?
It was great fun. It was a rush. Standing next to Springsteen and Steve Perry, who I would write with, and Daryl Hall, and then all those people on the ensemble, you know, the Pointer Sisters and everything. It was coming of age, kind of like being a senior in school instead of a freshman.
And of course, it was all for such a fabulous cause. And you've always been one for a good cause, haven't you? Because you're a deeply committed environmentalist. In fact, I know that you wrote the song Conviction of the Heart, and you actually think this one, of all the songs that you've done, is your very best work.
I think that the album is my best work because I'd hit a place where, you know, by the time we hit Back to Avalon, which was that probably the album before that, I had hit records, but they were gradually all getting written by other people and produced by other people. And I was getting further and further away from that connection to my own creativity and my own work. So I decided that the next record would be written by me and produced by me, and I would make a full commitment to making that the record of a lifetime. And at the same time, my marriage was coming apart. I was going through those changes. Then during the making of the record, I would fall in love with a new person, and that relationship would start. So I had this whole cycle, life cycle of death and rebirth happening in my life. And Leap of Faith got to chronicle that. And that's the sort of thing that an artist can wait your whole career to have, that moment where everything comes together. Your life and your art is one thing.
It's interesting you talk about that because it doesn't matter how famous you are or how much money you have, those are the sort of life events that you go through like the rest of us and in exactly the same way, don't you? So it's you're filled with the same emotions, the same problems, and you have to deal with it in the same way.
Yeah, except that I get to write about it. My job is to chronicle those emotions, chronicle those changes, and really be willing to look at it and dive deep into it so that I can artistically express what you're going through. Because we're all going through it. That's what life is.
So we get to relate to your words and you use it as a therapy to get through your own situation.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I didn't really perceive it as a therapy. I just saw it as my duty as an artist to use this opportunity to do something with it, and something in a way that it moves other people.
Yeah, you moved a lot of people. It even moved the likes of Al Gore, and it became the unofficial anthem of the environmental movement. Is that something that you pursue relentlessly these days too?
Not as actively, but yeah, I'm still involved in one way or another. And I've got an organization here in Santa Barbara called Unity, which keeps a focus on the footprint. I've been more involved in children's things, and Unity is very much focused on feeding and clothing those in need. So it's a closer to home thing.
I read something else very interesting about you was that when you're in concert, fans tend to bring gifts all the time. Kind of sounded like the way they threw the underwear at Tom Jones and the like. And on your website, you write, please don't bring gifts to me, donate instead because it can be much more meaningful. What do they bring?
Oh, any number of things, but not underwear. It's not that kind of thing. I remember about 10 years ago, I had an old friend of mine who'd come to the show, and he was looking from behind backstage through, you know, pulling the curtain aside. And he looked down, he said, geez, man, he said, you used to pull the prettiest girls, meaning the audience was made up of the prettiest girls. He said, where are they? And I said, that's them.
Yeah. That's them today, but I'm sure you're appealing to a whole lot of younger generations as well because you've endured. Your work spreads into so many different directions. Why the desire to work with kids?
I think that when I work with young people, I see myself in them. And I want to give to them the things I wished someone would have given to me, whether it's learning how to craft a song or just giving someone a leg up in their recording career. It's very gratifying. The strength as a young person is to invent, to create, to reform what's there in a new way. There's a lot of elasticity in the brain. Then as we get older, that brain becomes more crystallized and we become a depository of information. And so we do become masters at our craft, and we can then share that awareness with those young people who have an awareness of the importance of that mastership. I don't want to compete. I don't want to always be running in place, trying to keep up with the latest flavor. That's absurd. I had my turn and now it's your turn.
Don't you find, though, that young people are not interested in the wisdom of older adults? They think they know it all best, or is your experience different?
Well, of course, both. The one you just described is my own kids. The other experience of teenagers is those who are really hungry for information and want to know what the craft was and may continually be. There are threads that run through every generation of music.
How do you pass that information across to young people?
Well, I found that there are songwriters clinics all around the country. And if I go to teach at a clinic, invariably I end up in a writing situation. I did a clinic recently for a publishing company, and I ended up in a room with a female singer songwriter who was a very cute girl and really great voice. And when I started to explore with her what her influences were, she mentioned Sade. And I said, oh, well, if you're into Sade, then we want to build this on a bass line. So we came up with a bass line. And as we're creating the melody, it's all just coming together. But that's the sort of thing that I like to do.
Did you spend the pandemic sitting on your couch writing too?
No, we got e-bikes, and my lady and I would go out in the morning and find the perfect donut. That's the season I'm in.
It's wonderful to hear how happy you are. You've got 12 platinum albums, a pair of Grammys, hits on almost all the Billboard charts over several decades. You're still going. You've just released a new book. It's called Still All Right. It's the memoir from one Kenny Loggins.
I was very reluctant to write a memoir because I thought of it as the last thing you do before you die. And finally, I had a publisher talk me into it. In interviews, I call it a cross between a deposition and therapy. Because trying to remember all the shit that happened over the years is quite challenging. And that was one of the reasons I was reluctant to do it, was I just didn't remember all the stuff I wanted to.
Yeah, right. I don't remember anything. How did that process work for you?
It took about a year. I have no relationship to time. When I look back on things, they all seem to merge, except for the birth of my children. I'm really not sure what happened when. We did a lot of interviewing of old friends, road managers, musicians, calling them up and saying, what do you remember about this thing or that thing? One classic example, when I was making Leap of Faith, we're about 2/3 of the way through it. And I was moving my headquarters from Los Angeles up to Santa Barbara. And we loaded a truck up with two 32-track Mitsubishi digital recorders, all our amps and guitars. And on the way to Santa Barbara, it got stolen.
Oh, dear.
What happened to be in the truck, unbeknownst to me, were all my master tapes from Leap of Faith. So we didn't know if that was ever coming back. And I had to make a decision as to whether or not to keep recording overdubs or go back and try to recreate my masters. And so I literally took my own leap of faith. And in my body, I felt like the tapes are coming back. Don't waste your time re-recording the material that's going to come back. So I keep going with my overdubs, believing in my heart that masters would show up. And that 3 weeks later, the police find the truck, and the master tapes had been moved from the body of the truck to the cab and locked up in the cab. Everything else was stolen and gone.
How amazing.
I ended up with 5 singles off that record.
But you didn't put those master tapes in the cab of the truck, did you? Whoever'd stolen the truck had moved them to the cab.
Yes, correct.
How insane.
I suspect that some engineer or engineers had something to do with it, because whoever did it knew the value of those tapes. I think just some general thief wouldn't have even recognized what they were.
Wow, what an amazing story. So the moral of that story is keep the faith. Right?
Yeah, really. If you wish, that could be your moral.
Well, what was yours? I mean, you kept believing that they'd come back, and they turned up.
Yeah, it was more like I knew they'd come back. I just knew it. It wasn't like an exercise in keeping the faith. It just was faith. Is there a moral to that story? I don't know.
Kenny Loggins, you've got the book, Still All Right. Why the title?
Well, it's based on the song I'm All Right. We kicked around a lot of other titles, but that was my favorite.
You've still got those e-bikes? You're still riding them and searching for the world's best donut?
No, I had to stop doing that. It's like they were showing up too much in my gut. But yeah, we still have the e-bikes. We took up pickleball and we play that a lot. We love the game, and that's great exercise. Yeah, that's about it right now. Special projects when they come up.
And still writing new material?
Occasionally, yeah. There's a lady out of New York named Dory Berenstain who's making a documentary of my life. And in the process, she asked me if I would write a title song for it. So I'm in the process of recording that.
Fabulous. We'll look forward to watching that too. What an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with you, Kenny Loggins. It's just been terrific. Congratulations on a fabulous career.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I hope you found the chat with Kenny Loggins as interesting as I did. What an incredible career he's enjoyed. Smash hits on Hollywood's favourite soundtracks, rocking worldwide stages, and finding his way into children's hearts everywhere. His song Danger Zone was recently featured again in the 2022 movie Top Gun Maverick, earning over 1 million streams per day at its peak. Rest assured too that his memoir Still All Right is a fascinating read, as it provides a candid and entertaining perspective on one hell of an interesting life. Thank you for being here again with me today. And don't forget, if you have a guest that you'd like to hear from, just send me a message through the website, abreathofreshair.com.au, and I'll do my very best to get that person onto the show. I'll take my leave of you now and hope you have lots of fun until we meet again, same time next week. Bye now.